Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts. Now, here's Jim Dubois.
The 2013 legislative session in Minnesota will be remembered for turning Governor Mark Dayton's campaign promise to raise taxes on the state's wealthiest residents into reality. But the most historic piece of legislation this session is undoubtedly the legalization of same-sex marriage. Did the session result in groundbreaking progressive legislation, as the DFL governor and legislative majority claim, or did the party propelled into power last November misinterpret voter intent and move too far, too fast? This month on Access Minnesota, we sit down with U of M political science professor Kathryn Pearson to discuss local and national politics and what recent surveys are revealing about the attitudes of younger voters. But first, Professor Pearson walks us through the drastic shift in Minnesota politics over the gay marriage issue, and how within a year Minnesota went from nearly amending the state constitution to define marriage as between a man and a woman to the current law legalizing same-sex marriage. Kathryn Pearson is an associate professor of political science at the University of Minnesota. Professor Pearson, welcome back to Access Minnesota.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with one of the biggest political stories in the state. That, of course, at the conclusion of this past legislative session, the Minnesota legislature passed a same-sex marriage bill. Looking back to just a year ago, did it seem then that Minnesota would become the 12th state in the country to legalize same-sex marriage?
No, it did not. A year ago, the fight was fierce over the marriage amendment. But what I think was happening was that Minnesotans United for All Families was having a lot of conversations, raising a lot of money, and the momentum for the vote no on the marriage amendment campaign really just carried over after DFL legislators took over both chambers of the legislature back in November. And so the fight continued, and it became clear at a certain point that there were enough votes in both the House and the Senate to pass same-sex marriage, and that public opinion in Minnesota, as in the rest of the country, was continuing to shift in favor of same-sex marriage.
In the 2012 legislature, the then Republican-controlled legislature backed two constitutional amendments, one that would have required voter ID and the other that would have defined marriage as between a man and a woman. These amendments were extremely controversial, and there was a strong belief that perhaps the Republicans viewed this as a way to marshal their grassroots and get more supporters to come out to the polls. In many ways, it seems to have backfired. Was this a strategy that failed?
It is a strategy that failed. Indeed, it seemed that at least some of the motivations behind the amendments were to mobilize Republican voters, especially given the fact that the presidential race was not particularly competitive in Minnesota, nor was the top of the ticket with Senator Klobuchar's reelection. And although it did mobilize some partisan Republicans in support of the amendments, it also mobilized opponents of the amendments, and ultimately swing voters voted against the amendments as well. And I think we can say that absent the marriage amendment being on the ballot in 2012, there wouldn't have been the momentum in the other direction to propel same-sex marriage to victory in the legislature.
We're about a year and a half away now from the 2014 elections, and of course every member of the House of Representatives in the state legislature is up for re-election. Do you think there will be repercussions for the DFL voters in particular, and the sole Republican perhaps who voted in favor of same-sex marriage? Or is that a long time and are voter memories short?
Too soon to tell. Certainly for some of the rural DFL members and those 4 Republicans in the House and 1 in the Senate, I think they'll be answering a lot of questions about their vote. The Republicans in the House will be thinking about primary challenges, certainly, trying to fend those off, probably talking about their conservatism on other issues, their votes against DFL budgets and the like. And certainly some of the rural DFLers will spend a lot of time explaining their vote. But this is an issue where authenticity goes a long way. So even voters who disagree with a legislator's vote can sometimes accept it if they trust their legislators on other issues, and if the legislators don't run away from the votes, but in fact really explain to their constituents why they felt as though it was the right thing to do. Interestingly, Minnesotans United has also pledged support for those DFLers who represent districts that voted the other way on the marriage amendment, and those Republicans in the House who supported it as well. So it'll be interesting to see how much that interest group support matters to help them with re-election.
The same-sex marriage bill will obviously be one of the hallmarks of the 2013 legislative session here in Minnesota. Besides that particular piece of legislation, what other major issues were tackled by the legislature?
Well, the list is long. Republicans, in fact, are suggesting that it's overreach, although DFLers are also, I think, disappointed that not everything on their list was accomplished. But we have to look, of course, to the issue of taxes. Governor, or then candidate Mark Dayton, campaigned in his gubernatorial election on the issue of raising taxes for the wealthiest Minnesotans. And in fact, he did this with a new fourth tier of income tax for couples making over $250,000, singles making over $150,000. And so that, in fact, was instituted. A lot of education reform, both in terms of more funding for all-day kindergarten, early K, early ed, increased help for needy Minnesotans with early education, also some policy changes for education. Also thinking about the university system, 2-year tuition freeze, which is certainly a big deal for Minnesota's public universities. So a lot of action when it comes to education. Some issues that the Democrats didn't succeed on. Gun control legislation dropped fairly early on. Also a broader transportation bill, minimum wage increases. But again, on the sort of the accomplishment side of the ledger, earlier on in the session, so it didn't receive as much publicity as late, but Minnesota developed its own healthcare exchange as part of healthcare reform and MNsure. So a lot of changes when it comes to social services education.
When Access Minnesota returns, we'll hear more about Minnesota's historic and controversial 2013 legislative session.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages.